Okay, next up we are moving south from where Cam just was to the range of the Gopher Tortoise. So Tom Preble is going to talk to us variations among working landscape affects conservation outcomes for Gopher Tortoise in the southeast. Tom?
Thank you. And thank you all for being here, and thanks to NRCS for inviting us out here to talk about Gopher Tortoise. So I'm going to jump right in here and start with a little bit of background on the species, because we've been talking about birds and insects all day, so why not a reptile? Okay, so Gopher tortoises are reptiles, and as ectotherms, everything from their metabolism to activity levels, growth rates, and ultimately demographics is largely driven by their thermal environment. And so they really require open environments where light reaches down to the ground level, and they seek out these well-lit areas, there's my pointer, to excavate their burrows. And studies have shown that they'll actually spend about 75% of their time above ground just basking in front of the burrow, trying to maintain an optimal body temperature. And these locations are also important for nesting habitat, because they will oftentimes nest in front of their burrows in these sandy soils, and the sunlight helps to provide an optimal incubation temperature. Secondly, Gopher tortoises are herbivores, and they require an herbaceous layer for their food source. And their diet is very diverse, and it varies seasonally as plants become more or less digestible throughout the year. And it also varies with their age. And so adults are capable of digesting the tougher, more fibrous grasses, whereas the juveniles are dependent on low-growing legumes, succulents, and fruit. And lastly, they are an ecosystem engineer, and this is where they get their name. They excavate these burrows, and they could be anywhere from 2 to 8 meters in length. And they provide refugia, both for the tortoises and a number of other species in these habitats. They protect them from extremes in temperature, as well as desiccation. These environments are pretty droughty, and Gopher tortoises actually lose moisture much quickly than a lot of the western tortoise species. They are one of the, they are the predominant seed disperser for a number of plants. And their burrows create these micro disturbances that have cascading effects on plant succession, as well as the fire ecology in these systems. So where do we find these lovely creatures? Currently they're in 6 states in the southeast, and their range largely corresponds to the geologic coastal plain, and the sandy soils of that region allow them to dig their burrows, and as well as the former distribution of these once widespread open pine savannas and woodlands that were found in the southeast. Within this region, those savannas and woodlands they have a variable plant community composition. And in the southeast, that's largely driven by soils and moisture availability. We don't have a whole lot of topography like we do out west. But we do have a lot of variability in soil types. And so on our deepest sands, like this riverine dune habitat we find on our north to south running rivers, they're extremely well drained, and you get these very xeric environments, quite sparse, and they're and dominated by turkey oak and some scattered longleaf pines. But if we get just a slightly bit less well drained and a little bit more loamy type soil, this is kind of the more typical condition in the southeast. This is where we get the classic longleaf pine woodlands and this nice lush herbaceous layer, and this is wiregrass Aristida stricta, the dominant grass species in that system. And then we, on the most mesic sites, we'll have temporary flooding occurring in the wet seasons. But actually, Gopher tortoise can potentially occupy all of these habitats if they're maintained in an open condition, depending on the time of year. I mean, they don't like hanging out when it's flooded, but they will use these habitats in certain times of year. And that open condition is largely maintained by frequent surface fires. In the southeast, These need to occur on the order of about every 1 to 5 years to prevent succession and hardwoods moving into these pine stands. Within 5 years, you can get a dense shrub and sapling layer, and in another decade, there'll be a well-formed mid-story. So fire is very important. Other disturbances, drought, insect outbreaks, windstorms also create open habitat, but fire is the dominant driver. Okay, so the concern for gopher tortoise has largely stemmed from habitat loss and alteration. These savannas were once widespread, but they have largely been converted to row crop agriculture, urban residential development, and recently we're losing habitat to solar farms on some locations. The remaining forest is 90% privately owned, and it's used for a variety, or predominantly managed for timber production, but also for hunting, both recreationally and we have a number of quail plantations, and hunting's a pretty big business in the South. And some people just like managing their property for wildlife viewing. Unfortunately, few stands are currently managed in these open woodland and savanna-like conditions. Instead, fire exclusion has led to succession and closed canopy forests developing on, I guess you could probably say, the majority of sites. And you also have these dense litter layers that, combined with the overstory, both shade out the herbaceous layer. On a lot of sites, and then there's the sites where pine stands are intentionally managed as dense plantations for maximal timber output. And it's not uncommon for the herbaceous layers to be pretty altered in the forest stands out there on the landscape. And this occurs through things like intensive site preparation prior to planting, broad spectrum herbicide use, and histories of agriculture. A lot of this area was farmed previously. And so I guess that brings us to the conservation setting for gopher tortoise across much of its range is really this kind of patchwork of highly variable forest stands. And within that setting is where the Working Lands for Wildlife program of gopher tortoise has been implemented. And so the NRCS is funding or incentivizing the use of prescribed fire and canopy thinning on thousands of acres throughout the Southeast. And thanks to their funding, we've had an opportunity to study how these variable types of forest stands are responding to this management and estimating how they might differ in their ability to contribute to gopher tortoise conservation. And so here's just kind of an outline of the components of our study. So we are interested in how management actions interact with these different types of site conditions based on soils and their land use, current and former land use history, and how those influence the vegetative habitat components important to gopher tortoise. And then we are, of course, interested in how the vegetation and the abiotic habit components influence gopher tortoise abundance and density. So here is the study area for our project. Thanks to a lot of work on Melissa Martin's part, we were able to work across 3 states within the species range. And in 2017 and 2018, we got out and surveyed 296 different forest stands, and those came from 75 different private properties enrolled in Working Lands for Wildlife. So about 85% of the private lands, and then we did have 15% from some reference sites on nearby public properties. And so we sampled across a variety of ecoregions and got quite a bit of diversity in the types of stands we surveyed. On each property, we surveyed a series of 1 to 4 forest stands, and we used a 2-hectare plot size. And that plot size, relatively small, but it allowed us to locate our surveys within relatively homogeneous stand conditions. And we tried to stratify those based on current and historic land use. So you can see like this one here was located in a stand that was formerly agriculture back in the 50s, now is a planted pine stand. And we also try to maintain fairly homogeneous soil conditions within each of the areas we surveyed. So there's a ranking system for gopher tortoise burrowing suitability for soils. And so we try to keep those homogeneous, but also stratify among the stands we sampled. So on each one of those plots, we use line transect distance sampling to estimate Gopher tortoise abundance and density. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because Heather's going to talk a lot more about our LTDS approach. But essentially, it allows us to estimate density and account for differences in detection among habitat types. Within those same plots, we also surveyed the vegetation, measure and collected measures of vegetation structure at the canopy, shrub, and herbaceous layer, and also recorded the percent cover of grasses, forbs, litter, and bare ground. And then we were interested in the species composition. And really, we're kind of using the herbaceous species as indicators of disturbance or a disturbance history of the site. And we were particularly interested in wiregrass, and that's Aristida stricta. It's a particularly good indicator of undisturbed vegetation communities in the southeast, and it's also somewhat of a keystone species. It's very flammable, and some of the recent studies are showing that it might actually have a competitive or compete with shrubs, and it's a really good, it's a particularly good fuel and helps prevent shrub establishment when prescribed fire is applied. And we also record the dominant pine species. Okay, so getting into some of our results. Here I have all the plots I surveyed, just indexed on the x-axis, and the Gopher tortoise density that we estimated in those stands. And so you can see about half of our stands were occupied with Gopher tortoises, and there's a lot of variability in the density that we observed. And so as you could expect, we're interested in modeling how this variability varies with habitat components. And so just a little bit more methods on our and modeling those habitat relationships. So far I've been using up to a logistic regression approach, and we're treating density as kind of a binary variable, looking at, and we're interested in densities greater than 1 per hectare. And the reason being is that we think when tortoises get below that density, we start getting concerned about their ability to have mating opportunities and for their populations to be demographically stable. And so we're modeling that density as a function of predictor variables, the abiotic components like soil burrowing suitability, vegetation structure at the canopy, shrub, and herbaceous layer, and the herbaceous composition, looking at the percentage of ruderal species and whether or not wiregrass indicator species is present. And I modeled these using all possible combinations of linear, quadratic, and cubic terms for these different variables. And I fit generalized linear models in R. And then I model average the predictions from all the models with delta AIC less than 2, and looked at the predicted response curves for these variables. And so that's what we have here. And so our models did a decent job of predicting Gopher tortoise densities on these sites. So here I just have 4 of the habitat components I wanted to highlight today, starting with soil suitability right here. And so we have this nice positive linear response, and so that's good. So the experts who rank soil suitability seemingly did a pretty good job. We get a nice positive linear response like we would hope for. Similarly with shrub cover, it's basically what we had expected. As we have more shrubs, there's more shade, less of an herbaceous layer, and less suitability for Gopher tortoise. Herbaceous cover was more interesting because most of the management recommendations for tortoises are just, the more herbaceous cover, the better. And we're seeing a humped response here. So as you get over about 60% herbaceous cover, it looks like there's potentially negative impacts for tortoises. And so I'll say that these high herbaceous levels of herbaceous cover aren't very common, and they seemingly occur on the more productive soils, and often appear to be associated with disturbance, falling, like canopy thins or some kind of other soil disturbance. And when those come in, we get tall, weedy types of herbaceous plants like dog fennel, ragweed, goldenrod, and those. So I think the herbaceous layer itself is probably casting too much shade for tortoises in those scenarios. And this is kind of along the lines, we see similar response in relation to wiregrass presence. And so having that native wiregrass cover seems to have a much higher probability of having high gopher tortoise densities. And wiregrass always remains a nice low herbaceous layer. And so the last thing I want to talk about today is relating site conditions to these vegetative habitat components. And so I classified those plots that we went out and surveyed into 5 different scenarios based on the soils present on them, into mesic or xeric, and the site histories, whether or not they were formerly farmed, or as far as we can tell based on the historic imagery, were always forested, and whether or not that wiregrass community was present. And so just starting here with shrub cover, there are a couple. The 2 things that I thought were interesting is that the lowest levels of shrub cover were in xeric wiregrass and xeric ag. And so I think, 1, the soil moisture is helping to limit shrub cover on these xeric sites. 2, the wiregrass is probably acting as somewhat of a keystone. That flammable fuel is probably helping to increase the effectiveness of the fire, prescribed fire, and we want to look at that directly, modeling that directly eventually here. But the xeric ag might actually be another mechanism in that history of agriculture probably removed rootstocks of the shrub species. And so shrub stump sprouting is a big problem in the southeast. After fires go through, that you don't really kill the plant, they just sprout up again afterwards. And so in these ag sites, there's probably less stump sprouting going on. Herbaceous cover, not a whole lot of interest going on here, just that the xeric sites tend to have lower levels, and these high tails are what we find on these mesic ag and mesic forest sites. And finally, the ruderal species are essentially what we'd expected. Sites that have history of agriculture are having much higher rates of ruderal, weedy, herbaceous species, and that the xeric wiregrass communities do appear to have very few weedy species. And so lastly, I took our habitat model and predicted the probability of high density in these different scenarios, and compared that to the observed proportion of sites that had high gopher tortoise densities. And so they match up, they do a pretty good job. I think there's some additional modeling work I can do here to improve that fit a little bit better. But I think the most interesting thing is this especially high observed and predicted probability of having high gopher tortoise densities on these xeric sites with intact wiregrass ground cover. And so to summarize, do have a little bit of ongoing work to directly model management actions and some of the habitat responses. But the results so far are indicating that tortoises utilize a wide variety of habitat conditions on these private lands. That being said, we seem to be much more likely to observe high densities on these more xeric sites with that intact wiregrass ground cover. And so I think this leads to some questions about what are our conservation goals, and how do we want to manage for gopher tortoises? Do we want to manage a wide variety of sites and maybe go for a lot of acres of potentially kind of moderately suitable habitat, or do we want to focus in on the narrower xeric sites with wiregrass ground cover and try to get some really excellent gopher tortoise quality habitat, but be on limited acres? And one last plug for these sites with this intact ground cover. It seems like these wiregrass sites have special conservation value, but we know that they're pretty rare in the southeast, and they continue to be lost as people use broad spectrum herbicides, and these natural pine forests are converted to other land uses. And so I think that's just something we need to be more concerned with in the southeast. And with that, I just want to thank everybody who supported this project. And if I have any time for questions.
While I switch
okay.
Any questions for Tom?